This is Justice Voices, stories that need to be told, voices that need to be heard. These are important issues. Now, you yourself ended up in some very tragic circumstances. Let's loop
Sure,
back to
sure.
that. That led you to have a personal experience with what it's like to be inside
Absolutely,
prison.
David. So I was 18 years old when two of my friends, Ricardo and Alberto, were shot. And Ricardo was shot and paralyzed. And so these were two individuals that I really truly looked up to. They were much older than I was. They were in their mid 20s. And they really looked out for me quite a bit. I mean, they looked out for me even to the point where they would try to keep me out of trouble. I mean, they literally would, they were like my big brothers who would just say, hey, go back to school, or, why are you out here right now? Aren't you supposed to be working? Because I had this part-time job. And they were those kind of individuals. And I knew that. I knew they were good people. We were just happened to be in a gang, but I knew they really cared about me. So when they were shot, I remember a few weeks later going to my friend Ricardo's house and telling him, "Hey, I got these concert tickets. Like, let's go." And I was trying to just lift him up, and I remember him telling me, "Eddie, I'm not the same person." You know, it didn't dawn to me, David, about psychologically what is he going through. What does it really mean to be, um, paralyzed, from your waist down? And I remember a few days later, as I was grappling with this and trying to better understand it, a group of my friends said, "Hey, those guys that shot your friends, they're over there. They're just down the block." And long story short, I remember going out there, and I saw the group of people. And I remember I never intended, David, I want to be really clear. I never intended to kill anybody, but I did have every intention to paralyze someone so that they could suffer the same way that my friend was suffering. But as you could imagine, David, you shoot a gun, you have no control over those bullets. And there was a young man by the name of William Stuckey, who I won't go into the details, but very recently I've got to know who he is, who he was. This 18-year-old kid, same age as I was, who wasn't even from the neighborhood. He was from the north side, came down to hang out with some of his friends, and I shot and killed him. And there's no other nice way or a way of saying this. My anger, my frustration, my sadness of seeing my friend translated to trying to inflict that same emotions to someone else. And I took someone's life. I took a life that wasn't mine to begin with. And this past Saturday, I was in a meeting that had to do with the Fund Peace Coalition, a larger group of people working nationally around these issues. I The question was asked, like, why do you do this work? What brought you to this work? And I said two things. I said, one is, I live my life and I'm going to live the rest of my life to honoring the people that I've harmed the most. My family, other people, and that also includes William. Now, even though I've paid my debt to society, that's, for me, it's like I've done that already. But now I have an obligation to Christ. I'm a person of faith. I believe in God. And what that really means to me is living a life of atonement, of redemption. And the best way that I believe, with my limited knowledge of my understandings, is that I've chose to live my life by helping other people who are in the very similar positions that I was when I was 18 or at 14 or at 13, or someone who's coming home from prison when I was 32. And that's how I'm going to spend the rest of my life. Um, I was sentenced to 29 years by a judge named Vincent Gahn, which I had wrote a letter to him about 7 years ago. I've never delivered it. I have not delivered this letter, and I plan to. I plan to now more than ever, to thank him. To thank him because he could have given me 20 years. He could have given me 40 or 60 years. But he gave me 29 years, in which at the time, the law in Illinois, allowed me to do half of that time. So I did 14 years and 3 months, and I got 3 months of good behavior. Had I caught my case just a couple years later, David, I still would have been locked up. If I would have got 29 years just a few years later, I still would have been incarcerated. Which also goes back to your earlier comment. Have I done more good for our society today, right now, given the fact that I was released under this old law?
Which was an indeterminate sentencing system.
Pretty much. I mean, you do half of the time, exactly, and you do half of the time.
You have to do at least half the time.
Exactly.
But then you could do the maximum time if you're misbehaving. You're
correct.
Doing things. So the parole board decides when it is that you're going to be released during that time based on your individual behavior. Whereas now we've moved to so-called truth in sentencing, where no matter what you do to improve your life in prison, you're all going to serve, to become a better or a worse person, you're all going to serve the same amount of time in prison.
Yep. And so,
pretty
yes,
much.
David, spot on. But here's the reason why I'm glad you lifted that up. Our country, our society, we're fixated with this belief, right, that by incarcerating people and by throwing away the key, you're going to create a safer community. And all the literature, not only in this country, but around the world, says otherwise. We have a very hard time in being open and receptive to something different, which is changing culture in many ways, right? We're trying to change the culture of the criminal justice field, right? And that takes time. And that during that time, it also comes at a high cost of human beings. Now, the reason why I point this out too, David, is simply because of this. Again, had I still been incarcerated, or had I been sentenced under truth and sentencing law, I still would be incarcerated. I believe, and maybe I'm biased, that I've done more good for society today versus me still being incarcerated right now. And
Eddie, how can anyone rationally contest that proposition? And I'll tell you, when I listened to your story, I was thinking, yeah, and actually you'd be eligible, back when we had it in Illinois, for the death penalty.
Yep.
Now, in terms of would you deserve that? See, people don't distinguish between a couple of really important issues when it comes to things like the death penalty.
Yep.
Would you deserve the death penalty for intentionally shooting a person, knowing, even though you're in your mind, you're not thinking of killing them, you're going to paralyze them for life, and they do die? Okay, would you be eligible for it? Would you deserve it? In a strictly justice, eye for an eye sense, tooth for a tooth, yes, you deserve it. That's not the issue, is it?
No, it's not, David.
The issue is that a good policy? And I can tell you, you are a prime example of why, no, that would not be a good policy. Because what problem would you solve? What would you accomplish by giving Eddie Bocanegra the death penalty, or locking you up for life, or 60 years, or something like that? What would that have accomplished? I'll tell you one thing it would have accomplished. We wouldn't have what you have done with your life as a repentant person with an obvious covenant relationship with God that causes you to have a sense of mission, and probably, I would suggest as a fellow person of faith, some divine assistance in opening doors for you to make a difference in Chicago and in the lives of people in Chicago and elsewhere, that saves lives, that changes lives, and does a tremendous amount of good. Eddie, there is no rational way a person could say the world would be better if we had executed or locked up for life Eddie Bocanegra. There's no way we could do that.
David.
And yet there are those who say that's the way we should deal with these problems.
No, David. it's not the way, right? And I agree with you, and I appreciate those comments. And here's the bottom line behind that, David, is that people, like, I've been very fortunate, very blessed, and there's many people that are just like me, who you've interviewed, who are finding their way. They have a calling, right? And they're finding their ways through this calling, and it's amazing, David. It's amazing to see that, and we need to continue to lift that up. But there's also people who have done their time, who are now working in restaurants. They have their own home. They're working their 9 to 5, and they're good people too. And they've learned and they're moving on. Sometimes they struggle. Hey, David, listen, I'm 45 years old. I still struggle, David. I still wake up in cold sweat. I still wake up from nightmares. I still have like all these different things that happen in my head, right? And here's the,
Post-traumatic stress
oh, it
syndrome.
is. There's all the symptoms. My wife's a therapist, by the way, right? So she sees that, you know. But here's the thing.
And for some people, like we just interviewed one of the board members of Fully Free campaign who said there's nothing post about it. I still live in an environment in which it's just stress syndrome.
Especially when you're constantly working in the same field, right? There's a lot of that. But David, you know what happens a lot of times? Let's just say the governor of Illinois releases 1,000 people. All right, it's happened. Let's just stay with me for just a second. 1,000 people get released. Some of those people who are released, low level offenses. Some people who might have done 20, 30 years. You know what? We need the bed space. Where there's a budget issue, whatever it is, COVID, we're going to push you out 6 months. You're going to come out anyways. So we're just going to push you out 6 months. We're going to push out a year, whatever the case is. 1,000 people. David, somebody's going to mess up. Somebody's going to make a mistake. And
Well, particularly if they go back to the same circumstances that led them
yes,
to be there in the first place.
yes.
And compounding that by the fact that there are fewer opportunities to move forward than before they went to prison.
David, they come back home to this 30 years later to the same environments. Like nothing's changed. It looks actually even worse. And they get released from prison with nothing. Like it's not like, hey, here's a voucher for housing. There's very limited resources there that I'm aware of at the state level with Department of Corrections. But we just don't have enough resources to support people who need this. So many times it's like, here's a bus ticket, here's $10, and out you go. Right? Figure it out. But here's what I'm pointing out. We regress in this field of criminal justice reform. We regress for a couple of reasons. Sometimes we only focus on low-level offenses, but the truth is there's good data that demonstrates that people who've done more time than the lower-level offenses also have a less percentage chance of coming back to the system. So that's one thing. Secondly, let's just say 1,000 people get released. One person, 2 people end up robbing somebody or shooting somebody or harming someone, right? You know what politics do, especially opposition? They'll look at that 1 or 2 case and they build, right, their political strategy based on that. Mm-hmm. So the only people that really benefit from all this, right, are politicians who constantly keep going back and forth, back and forth. If we're trying to create real change, which I see with our lieutenant governor, and I see with Kim Foxx, I see this with several people, right? And I'm not here to debate politics. What I'm pointing out here is that some of these folks really use data to inform decisions. And that we cannot use as one outlier to condemn the rest of the 999 people, right? Who actually got their lives back on, who might be still struggling. And so I think we as a country have to kind of think about this very differently. Ask these serious questions, ask these hard questions. You know, like, okay, one person that came out of prison 2 weeks ago, this did harm somebody. Should we throw away, right, all the hard work that we've been doing because of the mistakes of one person? Or do we also try to unpack and understand where did we also fall short on that one person? What can we have done better for that one person? And could we create some guidelines or rules with politicians to say, people are making some good efforts in this space. Why regress? And I think that David, to me, is a sticky point, right? And what I see around this country, because the truth is, in the last 15 plus years, we have seen less people incarcerated. We see less people um, in terms of vandalisms and crime go down. Like there's stats across the country. This past 2 years, we've seen an increase in gun violence. That is true. We've seen it here in Chicago. We're seeing in many other cities across the state of Illinois and in other cities for that matter. How much is associated to COVID? How much is associated to what's happening with the civil unrest, with the trust of law enforcement and so on? Like it's a combination of all that. But being in a space where there's tension is a good thing because then that allows us to really think and process these issues that we're grappling with. How do we make better informed decisions as we move forward? And that is critical, David. And that's why I'm here, right, being interviewed because my story in itself is not unique. There's many examples that I can give you of good people who are doing perhaps much better work than I am.
That's why your story is important, Eddie, because it's not unique.
Yep.
It's not unique. I mean, Eddie Bocanegra, of course, you've done wonderful things, and some of that may be unique, but it's not because you, Eddie, are unique. You're an extraordinary person. Well, there are other extraordinary people that are out
Absolutely.
there that are doing some terribly tragic things, and it could have been different, and it can be different.
Yeah.
What's really significant to me about your story is that you have done some extraordinary things, but there are so many people like you that could also do extraordinary things if they were somehow on a different track. Now, how to get there? Yeah, that's a problem we need to be addressing. How to deal with all this trauma? Yeah, that's what we ought to be addressing. And your program is addressing those things, and I want to get to that. I don't want to cut you off. But I want to move to at some point soon in this conversation to READI Chicago and how you're going about addressing those root cause problems. Yeah. To hear more about how READI Chicago is both saving and transforming lives, please either view segment 3 of this episode linked below or listen to the full audio podcast, available as episode 12 on our website at justicevoices.org. Mr. Bocanegra's personal backstory was the topic of the first of these video segments. You can either listen to that or view it using the links below. For more episodes of Justice Voices, please visit either our website for full audio conversations or go to our YouTube channel for selected video segments. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to both the audio and video versions of this program. And on this YouTube version, hit the like and bell buttons. There's a lot more coming that you won't want to miss. This is Justice Voices, stories that need to be told, voices that need to be heard.